So I will time myself as well.
So you have 26 minutes total.
Oh, wow. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Katie, for some really important perspective and a voice of conscience. Today, I'm presenting on two very different issues, but I also like bringing in perspectives from multiple disciplines, so I'm not exactly merging them. The first talk I'm giving is an adaptation of a term paper and final seminar presentation I did as part of my neuropharmacology class in my psychology master's program at William & Mary, in which I'm a first year. So this is about the concept of psychedelics as super-placebos, which I didn't come up with, but I did a lit review to sort of elaborate on. So an enduring mystery about psychedelics, among many infinite enduring mysteries, is compared to any other class of pharmacological compounds, why do psychedelics' effects depend so heavily on set and setting? I mean, it's remarkable. And why do psychedelics have such an enormous range of effects? Cognitive, emotional, perceptual, spiritual. None of the existing models really address that particular question. Why that seemingly infinite versatility? I mean, set and setting matter when it comes to, alcohol or heroin or SSRIs, but not to any degree near how they matter when it comes to psychedelics effects. So this is a concept that was first elaborated by Rick Strassman, actually. I don't know if y'all know him. He was really the pioneer of DMT research in medical context in the West, and also talked about at length by the Israeli social scientist Ido Hartog-Sin. They both quote Andrew Weil as saying that psychedelics might just be the most powerful placebos out there. Now, what does that mean? This isn't to say that psychedelics effects are, all about suggestibility. What it's saying actually is that psychedelics themselves are potentially so powerful because they, more than anything else, tap into the fundamental mechanisms that underlie the operation of the placebo effect. So people have talked about psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers of the content of the mind. After all, psychedelic, the term coined by Humphrey Osmond, means mind manifesting. And when you think about how the placebo effect is generally understood, it's about manifesting the power of the mind to change the body's response. And much work has been done on how suggestibility, which is a key property of psychedelics, is bound up in the placebo effect. So this isn't just a definitional question. I decided to set out to find whether we can find overlaps between the known mechanisms of psychedelics and the known mechanisms of the endogenous placebo effect. And the results are mixed, but I think it's an important avenue of inquiry, so I'll present some of that. So first of all, we'll take a neurotransmitter's eye view. 5-HT is serotonin. I just decided to abbreviate it. It's well known at this point that the main mechanism of action, at least on a direct neurotransmitter receptor level of classic psychedelics, is that they are serotonin receptor agonists. So they stimulate serotonin receptors, a wide range of them, particularly the 5-HT2A receptor. And what they do is they basically mimic the effects of serotonin and do it even better than serotonin itself. And what people doing research on the mechanisms of the placebo effect have found is that, among other things, elevated serotonin levels are correlated with stronger placebo effects in Parkinson's patients. Levels of serotonin have been suggested as a possible modulator of expectations in the prefrontal cortex as they relate to the strength of the placebo effect. And then finally, Robin Carhart Harris and David Nutt found that signaling involving the 5-HT2A receptor in a psychedelic context and outside of it is associated with heightened environmental sensitivity and suggestibility, again, which are sort of the backbones of the placebo effect. There's parallel literature when it comes to dopamine. So elevated release of striatal dopamine in the placebo treatment of Parkinson's disease patients was also correlated with a stronger placebo response. And elevated levels of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens are proportional to the placebo response in healthy adults who are given a pain challenge. And then finally, dopaminergic reward pathways that are thought to be related to expectation have often been cited in the placebo effect. Why is this connected to psychedelics? Because we think of the serotonergic pathways, but in reality, catecholaminergic psychedelics like mescaline and also empathogens like MDMA stimulate dopamine release as well as serotonin release. And also LSD, among many other effects, is lower level agonist of dopamine receptors. Another thing that was interesting is that a paper came out a few years ago citing sort of a framework for understanding the possible genetic mapping of placebo response. They called it a draft of the human placebome. And what was really interesting about it was that a lot of the genes and gene polymorphisms that are implicated in it are directly involved in the metabolism of psychedelic compounds. Like COMT is the name of both a gene responsible for and an enzyme involved in the breakdown of the class of substances that includes MDMA and mescaline and the whole 2C series. Monoamine oxidase is involved in the processing of certain lesser-known psychedelics like harmine and harmaline, but also is critical for the metabolism orally of DMT and ayahuasca. And then also we find all of these serotonin transport and serotonin breakdown related genes that seem to be directly linked to strength of placebo response, including the 5-HT receptor 2A gene that codes for the frequency and distribution of the single receptor that's most closely associated with classic psychedelic responses. So that's been cited as very closely correlated, having one form of the gene or another, to the strength of someone's placebo response. And then, sort of very briefly, the view from functional connectivity. So at this point, we know that psychedelics, among other changes to functional connectivity, seem to depress overall activity in the default mode network, which is related to concept of self and rumination and sort of being stuck in a particular self-conception or way of doing things. But also they increase between network connectivity. And there's a burgeoning literature on what changes in functional connectivity are connected to the placebo effect. So it's really a mixed bag here, but what I found interesting is that there are a lot of different pathways within the default mode network that seem to be affected by placebo across a number of different disease states. I'm not going to run through every single one of them, but this is really a booming field, and it's sort of an instructive clue that this path might be helpful in understanding sort of on a higher level what kind of cascades happen in the brain beyond the simple neurotransmitter pathways, which we often ascribe a little too much solidity to. They have their effects at higher levels of network complexity in the brain, in both psychedelics and the placebo effect. And then finally, at this point, it's hard to talk about the effects of psychedelics without talking about their effects on neuroplasticity. I know that our first talk this morning dealt with the psychoplastogenic effects of psychedelics and how they might relate to the therapeutic benefits of psychedelics in psychiatry. We've known this about ketamine for a long time, but in a monumental study last year in rat neuron models, we found that DOI, DMT, and LSD have a variety of psychoplastogenic effects at different levels of neuronal growth. So they seem to lead to increased neurite growth, spine density, and development of new synapses, which has especially been implicated in the antidepressant effects of ketamine and conventional psychedelics. And it turns out that this concept of neuroplasticity comes up in the placebo literature again and again. So there's the idea that the mind over matter concept that's often cited in the effects of placebo treatment result from enhanced plasticity, that this might also be an important mechanism in the effects of psychotherapy. And that sort of psychotherapy and psychedelic administration reinforce this psychoplastogenic effect in each other, or sort of form a virtuous cycle. And then it seems that placebo mechanisms seem to boost neuroplasticity in the treatment of both depression and schizophrenia, alongside active medicines. So it turns out that in trials that include both an active medical trial and placebo group, both seem to boost neuroplasticity in these mental health disease states. And then one more thing, variation in placebo response might be linked to what version of a gene coding for brain-derived neurotrophic factor you have, and we know pretty robustly that ketamine and likely other psychedelics are involved in the pathway that leads to more growth of BDNF. I don't have much time if I'm going to partition my time evenly, but a lot of people have tried to revise the terminology of the placebo effect to sort of focus it more on the concept of a meaning response. And some studies have even indicated that enhanced meaningfulness rather than degree of expectancy of a result from a treatment is actually the best correlate with a placebo response, and that baseline levels of suggestibility and trait absorption are linked to placebo response, strength of placebo response, propensity for mystical experience, and likelihood of a mystical or transformative experience under the influence of psychedelics. So this is all very telling. There are a few ways to test this hypothesis, and it's very possible that it is actually dose dependent. I'm going to skip because I really want to focus on my next talk. So maybe we can take questions after the full session. Okay, Walt Whitman and the psychedelic experience.